Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Uber Cordero show for this week. And this week we are talking about the ancient Egyptian civilization. So if you like what we are presenting here, you can subscribe on YouTube. Also follow us on Facebook at Uber Cordero Show and on Instagram as well as on Twitter. So let's talk about some important things. And by the end of this show, we will have answered if the ancient Egyptians were black or not. Another thing which we are following on this week is why is important? Why is that important? Why is it important that we talk about whether the Egyptians were black or white? And so these two questions are paramount, and we're going to examine them in the course of this presentation. Now, to start with, I want to highlight an important point that I've been thinking about throughout this week. And it is that how important for us to recognize how we think. How do you think? How do you think matters? How you think about a certain thing, about a certain idea, about a certain construct. And one of the things that I'm trying to bring out here is to challenge what we call dogmas of thoughts, and how we think often arise from the books we read, the people we interact with, the cultural influences and the culture that we happen to live in. And challenging these already known truths can be very problematic, even threatening in certain circumstances. And now the question that I have for my audience is, why will you hold such thoughts, even in the face of new revelation? Why do we hold certain thoughts that might be not proven to be true, but we still hold on to them? So I bring this context in order to talk about ancient Egyptian civilization. And the first thing I want to do is to offer perspectives on Egypt. And there are several perspectives on understanding ancient Egypt. So I'm going to talk about three main perspectives. And the first one is the Eurocentric perspective. And in this line, the argument is made that ancient Europe is the genesis of Western civilization. So we follow a chronological order of Egypt, Greece, Rome, French, English, and subsequently American civilization. So this is a chronological account which premises on the idea that Egypt founded this civilization and it's important to modern science. So now Westerners have to claim it, have to make it their own, because it's the genesis of what we currently know as civilization, modernity. And this has been documented many times, and one of the books that is most famous for it is called The Conquest of Civilization by James Breasted. And Breasted simply made the argument that the Egyptian civilization forms the basis of Western civilization, and there is no other society that can claim credit for it other than the Westerners. The second argument, which is out there in explaining Egyptian civilization, is one that is called the Afrocentric perspective. And the Afrocentric perspective argues that Egypt is the starting point of Africa's civilization. It's the origin of African societies, and there's a great deal of sharing that has happened, that African societies borrow from Egypt. And all civilizations that occur in Africa have remnants of the Egyptian civilization. This school of thought is called the Kemet School, and it was mostly propelled by a Senegalese scholar who wrote the book, The African Origin of Civilization. And his name is Sheikh Anta Diop. And Anti-Diop has followers. Some of them include Maulana Karenga and Molefi Asante. And they argue that Egypt is unquestionably African, and not only African, but Black African. The last perspective which I focus on is the Universalists. The Universalists argue that Egypt was a cosmopolitan society and had a long history. And in those histories came different powers, different cultures that influenced it. So the river Nile flows from Lake Victoria and the highlands in East Africa, going north toward the Mediterranean. And in that almost over 1,000 miles, there are people as dark as Shaq O'Neal and people as light as the king of Sweden. So it is varied, and all these cultures have influenced what is today called the ancient Egyptian civilization. Now, here is where I get in. And I argue that Egypt is in Africa and is part of Africa. To the extent which Egypt is Black depends on the cultural and theoretical perspective that one holds. So, geographically, Egypt is located in Africa. That is not debatable. And those people who founded the ancient civilization, if they live today, they would identify as either African or other identity that might be prevailing. But whether that civilization was completely Black, as in Negroid, is, or what we call African in this country, sub-Saharan African, that is debatable. And there are evidences that have shown that Egypt had elements of African people in it. Herodotus, the founder of modern history, described early Egyptians as having woolen hair and also of dark skin. There are paintings which uses red painting and the darker skin paintings to show that perhaps they were not as slight as many have perceived. King Nerma, or also called Mene, the founding king, Pharaoh, the first one, who unified all the ethnicities in Egypt and founded the Egyptian civilization. His picture shows him having features that are sub-Saharan African. So there is evidence to that. But I'm not saying that that Africans are appropriating the Egyptian civilization. All I'm saying that Egypt has a long history, and in each episode of those histories, there are different powers that came in and influenced the people and the culture. So that the DNA studies done today reflect that. So there's a DNA study which was done about 3 or 4 years ago, which found out that the majority of the Egyptian mummies that were excavated and examined showed that these people were mostly of Middle Eastern origin, what we call the Levant, which is Syria, Jordan, Israel, and all those countries that surround it. That their DNA proved that these people were from there. But it was from a specific era of Egyptian history called the Middle Kingdom. And in this era, the Hyksos, people from Asia Minor, had captured power and ruled Egypt. Now, it's important to understand that notions of race have permeated historiography. They cloud our view of things. They cloud how we see things, how we interpret them. Because we have to refer back. Why are we concerned about their race or whatever? That is something that the early Egyptians did not concern about. Even though it was an aristocratic society, it was multicultural. The Libyans were there, the Phoenicians were there, the Romans, the Greeks. There's even a city named after Alexander the Great who captured Egypt later on. The Arabs come in 640 AD. There are also elements of other societies that are mingled and associated with these Egyptians. Race did not matter. They did not see race as we see it today. People mattered on what they contributed. Even though it was an aristocratic society, that means kings and nobilities were at the top. Aristocrats were not racialized. So a black person from Nubia, as we later see in late Egyptian society, also came to be kings and queens of Egypt. In fact, there are more pyramids in present-day Sudan and southern Egypt, places that are populated by sub-Saharan people, than there are in Giza next to Cairo. So the fact that we are obsessed about the race of Egyptians speaks more about us than of the early Egyptians, and that's the ultimate argument I'm making. We shouldn't be obsessed about Egypt as a black or white civilization. We should be celebrating the fact that Egypt, in the early days of human civilization, was able to form a multicultural society that is still majestic as it was almost 3,000 or 4,000 years back. And this society was multi-ethnic and in many ways a reflection of the intermingling. And it was in Africa. So in that way, it should not be taken away from African history as many other world contributions. Because for the Eurocentrics, admitting that Europe is part of Africa and Africa contributed to it is almost attacking the premise of their logic, and they resist this. So I'm not saying, oh, it is a totally black civilization. I'm saying there is an African contribution in Egypt which has to be accepted and respected. And that ancient Egypt was racially homogeneous and cosmopolitan in all respect. Thank you very much. If you like the Uber Cordero show, please sign on and keep on sending your questions so that I can do research and answer them. Follow us on Instagram and on Facebook. Thank you very much.